So I don't know how long this is going to take. We were kind of running over things right before we hit record here. But I wanted to share with you guys some observations that I made the other day. I was at a funeral. I didn't know the person. I'm friends with his brother, the guy that passed away. A young guy is always harder. Funerals are never fun. They're never easy. But it's always a little bit tougher when the person is young. I say young. This guy he was in his 30s, which is still really young for somebody to leave this life. So these are the things that you're thinking about when you walk into the funeral. Like, who was this person? Most of the time, you don't go to a funeral for somebody you don't know. But even whether you know them or not, you're thinking about who they were, who they might have been, what your perception of them was based on what you knew about them, or how much you loved them based on the way that you knew them, or maybe they were a relative or not, or all these things, these emotions that come on, and you get these regardless, right? Because you're at a funeral and it's just hard. And you look around and maybe you don't know a soul there, but you're looking around and you're seeing other people who are hurt and they're broken in this moment, and they're struggling with the loss of their loved one and all these questions they have that they'll never have an answer to. But in the middle of all that, I see things as I'm watching the preacher, the family, and how they're responding. And I got to shout out to, I'll shout him out. My buddy Gabriel Brown lost his brother. Called me and told me about it early, very early, right after he'd heard. Actually left me a voice. It was so early one morning, like I wasn't up and functioning yet, and he left me a voice message, so I heard it. And he talked about some things that he had learned and some things that he was going to try to apply in this, in this difficult time. And Gabriel's handled grief like a champ. He's gone toward the memory. Like we talk about, my wife and I talk about going toward the grief. Like we lost our son in 2021. And as opposed to just never speaking his name again and never talking about him and never looking at pictures of him, we want to go to the places that he liked, and we want to talk about who he was and stuff like that. And Gabriel's done that. And it was just really cool to watch him. I say cool, that's probably the best way to say it, I guess. There's not a good way to say it. It was cool how you handled your grief, but it was encouraging to see that even in his darkest time, he was handling it the way he was. But then I get to spend time there at the funeral and watch his family and his mom. His mom is an absolute soldier, man, a rock. And she stood up in front of the church at the end and said a bunch of wonderful things that was just not in her character to do, as far as what I know about her, standing up in front of a room and talking to people. That's one of the toughest things. People are more afraid of death itself or more afraid of public speaking than death itself. But yeah, she was an iron horse up there. Like, she just got there and belted it out. And Gabriel did a great job too. But I'm seeing these people, and I see what family meant to them and how they bonded together in this time. And I thought that was really cool. It was really important because they didn't expect this young man to pass away. And when that moment arrives, all you've got is each other. You've got your family, you've got your friends, you've got your memories, you've got the way that you felt about that person. And they kind of held each other together, and that was really cool. The pastor was another thing. It was a different thing altogether. An additional thing, I guess, not totally different, but this was it was a bilingual funeral. I'd never been to a bilingual funeral before. So the young man, his mom's side of his family is Hispanic, and his dad's side is African American. And you had people that spoke English as their first language, and you had people who might not have spoken English at all. So there's the pastor doing the ceremony was a Hispanic gentleman. And he gets up and he says a few words in Spanish, and he says a few words in English, and he says a prayer in Spanish, and he says a prayer in English, and he plays a song in Spanish, and he played one in English. And it just kept going back and forth. And it reminded me, the first time I ever saw it or heard it, a guy named Craig McClure came to my church and preached one Sunday. And you've seen, if you go way back with the podcast, you've seen Craig. He's been on here before. But Craig is a pastor, a missionary, I guess, so to speak, in the Dominican Republic, where they speak Spanish. So Craig stands up in front of our church, introduces himself. I'm going to preach to you guys today, whatever preachers say when they get up and do a guest spot. Let's pray. And then he rips off this 10-minute prayer in Spanish. And the thought reoccurred to me at this funeral a couple of days ago, like God speaks Spanish too. You know, God understands us in Spanish the same way that he understands us in English or in French or in German or in Tutsi or Romani or, you know, any other language you could think of. And that's just how big God is, and he's not bound by our language. I didn't know a word the guy was saying when he went off on these Spanish tangents, I guess. But God did. And it didn't matter that I didn't know. That guy was up there praying, and all that was important at that point was what he was saying to God, and it didn't matter in what language. So that was a big deal. And again, it brings back into perspective as much as you could put it into perspective who God is and how omniscient he is, and he knows all of our languages and all of our things. But that was a big deal to me, and it said a lot. And it was, you know, that God is present among all people, so he's not restricted in the same ways that we are. There were people again that spoke one language or the other, maybe entirely, but God is on both sides of that, and I thought that was really cool. The pastor also did a fantastic job of relaying a gospel message and talking about who Jesus is and the promise that we have to see each other again, our loved ones, people that we've lost and gone on before us, relaying that message at a funeral, right? And why would you not? That's the hope that we have. It's never easy. It's certainly not easy to perform, to officiate a funeral. It's less difficult when you know that there is redemption and there's resurrection and there is eternity with God. And those are things that, as bad as we hurt right now in this life, in this moment, we don't have to worry about that. We're going to see our loved ones again one day. And he did a great job conveying that message. He talked about Lazarus, and they go to get Jesus, and they're like, "Hey, Jesus, Lazarus is sick, and he's going to die," and Jesus is not in a super big hurry. And then, of course, Lazarus dies, and they had to tell him, Lazarus, I guess I'm getting the story out of order a little bit. Lazarus has died, and they told him, if you'd have been there, he wouldn't have died at all. And Jesus was like, well, you're going to see him again. And they say, well, yeah, we're going to see him at the resurrection. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. So he's pointing these things out to him as far as, who he is, because they saw Jesus every day. They knew who he was. And on some level, he may have just become some guy for them. And in this moment, they were reminded of who he was. And we've got to be careful that he doesn't just become some guy for us and some, a comma in a sentence. We look at him for who he is and the fact that he is the resurrection. And this pastor did a fantastic job of that, relaying that message. And if you're going to perform a funeral or a wedding or any other speech, if you have the gospel in your heart, that's the time to get it out. Nobody's going to object to something you say at a funeral or a wedding. It's bad form to do that. But they can hear that message when they otherwise wouldn't have. There were people in that room that might not have ever heard the gospel before or not heard it in a long time. There were folks there that didn't go to church. There were folks there that did, so you get a little bit of everybody at a thing like a funeral. But, man, roll out the gospel. Talk about that hope that we have. This is not... I don't know. We've sort of branched out a little bit on the podcast, and we're not like, I don't know, not every episode is about the gospel and our religion. We try to work that in at least at some point, but sometimes the show is just about clean entertainment and telling, somebody's story. Right before this episode, we recorded another one. This is the second episode tonight that we've done. But we just sat down and told a story with a young man. We talked about religion and things, but we talked about his life and his story and what an interesting life this kid's had. I say kid, he's 27. But I thought this was a good opportunity for the show here, the podcast, to come back around and talk about that the gospel a little bit and where we're rooted and where we're founded. We always will be, and that's always going to be who we are, regardless of whether or not we mention certain things, aspects of religion, Christianity in any given episode. That's still who we are, and we're going to hang on to that no matter what, because it's God that put us here and gave us this stuff and placed us in this cool studio and made sure we had all this equipment and keeps bringing in these fantastic guests and assembled this team that we have here that produces these episodes. But we got to remember who he is, and when we have the opportunity to share that and tell others about it, and then we do that too. But that's it. That's what I wanted to share with you guys. Just like I said, just observations from a funeral, things that I've picked up, and things that resonated with me, regardless of the fact that I didn't know the young man that had passed. But we can still learn things. There's always, every moment is a teachable moment, which means every moment is a learning moment as well. So keep your hearts and your minds open, and remember the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. God bless you guys. We love you. See you next time.